On a quiet Sunday morning in 1963, four young girls walked into church and never came out. This is the story of a bombing that shocked the world, an investigation that uncovered suspects early, and a justice system that took decades to act. The year was 1963. The place was Birmingham, Alabama. At the time, it was one of the most divided cities in the United States. Racial tensions were high, protests were frequent, and violence had become an unsettling part of daily life. So frequent were these attacks that the city had earned a grim nickname, Bombingham. Homes, churches, and gathering places connected to black communities were often targeted. Fear lingered in the air, yet life continued. Families still gathered, children still played, and faith remained a source of strength. At the center of this tension stood the 16th Street Baptist Church. It was more than just a place of worship. It was a symbol of unity, a place where people came together not only to pray, but to organize, to speak, and to push peacefully for change. On Sundays, the church came alive. The sound of singing filled the halls. Conversations echoed through the corridors, and children, dressed in their best clothes, prepared for service with excitement and innocence. September 15th, 1963, began like any other Sunday. In the basement of the church, four young girls were getting ready for Youth Day. They talked with each other, shared small jokes, and adjusted their dresses as they prepared to go upstairs. It was a moment filled with warmth and normalcy, a moment that felt safe. Their names were Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley. They were between 11 and 14 years old. They had dreams, families, and futures waiting for them. But beneath them, hidden from sight, something had already been set in motion. At approximately 10:22 that morning, everything changed. A powerful explosion tore through the church. The blast came from beneath the building, where a bomb had been placed in the basement. The force was devastating. Walls collapsed, windows shattered, and debris filled the air in an instant. Inside, confusion turned to panic. People screamed. Dust and smoke made it difficult to see or breathe. Parents rushed through the chaos, calling out for their children. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the destruction was severe. More than 20 people were injured, and for four families, the unimaginable had already happened. News of the bombing spread rapidly. Within hours, it reached across the country and beyond. What had taken place inside that church was not just another act of violence. It was something that struck at the heart of humanity. The public reaction was immediate. Shock, grief, anger. Questions filled the air. Who would do something like this? And why? Authorities moved quickly to begin an investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation deployed dozens of agents to the scene. Witnesses were interviewed. Evidence was collected. Every possible lead was pursued. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that this was not a random act. This was planned, intentional. The church itself had been chosen as a target. As the investigation continued, attention turned toward individuals known for extremist views and violent behavior. By 1965, several suspects had been identified. These were men with connections to groups that openly opposed civil rights progress. To investigators, the direction seemed clear, but building a case strong enough for court proved far more difficult. Witnesses were often afraid to speak. Some feared retaliation. Others lacked trust in the system meant to protect them. At the same time, certain pieces of evidence gathered during the investigation could not be used in court due to legal limitations at the time. The result was a painful standstill. Authorities believed they knew who was responsible, but they could not secure convictions. As time passed, frustration grew. The case that had once moved quickly began to slow. Public attention shifted. Other events took over headlines. For the families of the victims, the passage of time did not bring relief. It brought silence. A silence filled with unanswered questions. Days became months. Months became years. Still, the memory of that Sunday morning remained. The damaged church was eventually repaired, but the emotional scars left behind could not be so easily restored. More than a decade later, the case would take a turn. New efforts were made to revisit the investigation. Old files were reopened. Evidence was reviewed again, this time with fresh perspective and renewed determination. Investigators looked closely at what had been missed, what had been overlooked, and what had changed. And slowly, progress began to return. In 1977, 14 years after the bombing, one of the suspects was finally brought to trial. His name was Robert Chambliss. This time, the case moved forward. Witnesses came forward, evidence was presented, and after years of waiting, a verdict was reached. Chambliss was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. For many, it was a moment of long-awaited accountability. But it was also clear that the story was not yet complete. The investigation did not end there. Years later, with continued effort and advances in investigative techniques, more developments emerged. In 2001, another suspect was tried and convicted. Then in 2002, a third individual faced the same outcome. Nearly 4 decades had passed since the bombing. Justice, delayed for so long, had finally reached its conclusion. But the time that had been lost could never be restored. The events of that day left a lasting impact, not just on the families involved, but on the entire nation. The bombing became a defining moment in the civil rights movement. It brought increased attention to the realities many communities were facing. It also influenced change. Laws were passed. Awareness grew. Conversations that had once been avoided could no longer be ignored. The tragedy served as a reminder of the consequences of hatred and division, but also of the importance of resilience and unity. Today, the story is remembered not only for the crime itself, but for what followed, for the courage of those who continued to seek justice, for the strength of families who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten, and for the reminder that even when justice is delayed, it can still be pursued. 4 young girls lost their lives that morning. They did not choose to be part of history, yet their story became part of something larger than any single moment. Their names continue to be spoken. Their memory continues to be honored, not defined only by what happened, but by the change that followed. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe the past should never be forgotten, consider subscribing for more true crime cases based on real events. Because sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that took the longest to be heard.